When most people think about World War I, they picture trenches, poison gas, and millions of young men dying in muddy fields across Europe. They imagine Kaiser Wilhelm's ambitions, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, or the tangled web of alliances that supposedly dragged the world into its first global war. But what if I told you that behind every bullet fired, every trench dug, and every life lost, there was a financial machine that not only enabled the carnage, but actively profited from it? What if the real architects of the Great War weren't generals or politicians, but bankers sitting in mahogany-paneled rooms, calculating how much money they could make from human suffering? The story you're about to hear isn't taught in history classes. It's not found in most textbooks, because the truth about who really started World War I threatens to shatter everything we've been told about modern warfare, international finance, and the puppet strings that control nations. This isn't just ancient history. The same forces, the same methods, the same ruthless calculations are at work today. And if you don't understand how they operate, you'll never see the next crisis coming. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a small group of financiers manipulated entire nations into the bloodiest conflict the world had ever seen. You'll see how they funded both sides of the war, guaranteed their own profits regardless of who won, and walked away richer while Europe burned. But more importantly, you'll recognize the pattern that keeps repeating throughout history, from the trenches of France to the economic battlefields of today. Let me start with something that will shock you. In 1914, when Europe exploded into war, none of the major powers had enough money in their treasuries to fight for more than a few months. Germany, France, Britain, Russia, Austria, Hungary, all of them were essentially broke before the first shot was fired. So how did a war that was supposed to last weeks drag on for 4 brutal years? The answer is simple. Someone was lending them the money to keep killing each other, and that someone made sure the slaughter would continue until every last penny of profit had been squeezed from the carnage. The conventional story tells us that World War I began on June 28, 1914, when a Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. France honored its alliance with Russia. Germany invaded Belgium to reach France. Britain declared war to protect Belgian neutrality. Within weeks, Europe was at war. It sounds logical, even inevitable. But this version of events is a carefully constructed lie designed to hide the real story. The real story begins not in Sarajevo, but in the private offices of the world's most powerful banking houses. The Rothschilds in London and Paris, the Warburgs in Hamburg and New York, J.P. Morgan in America. These weren't just wealthy businessmen. They were financial puppeteers who had spent decades positioning themselves to control the money supply of entire nations. And by 1914, they were ready to pull the strings that would drag the world into its most profitable war. Consider this. In the years leading up to 1914, these banking dynasties had systematically gained control over the central banks of every major European power. The Bank of England, the Banque de France, the German Reichsbank. All of them were either directly controlled by or heavily influenced by this small network of international financiers. They didn't just lend money to governments. They decided which governments would have access to credit and on what terms. In effect, they had the power to strangle any nation economically or to flood it with enough money to wage war. But here's where it gets interesting. These bankers faced a problem by 1914. The world was becoming too peaceful, too prosperous. International trade was booming. Living standards were rising across Europe. The great colonial empires had carved up most of the world and were settling into profitable routines of exploitation. There simply weren't enough crises, enough conflicts, enough desperate governments willing to borrow money at the astronomical interest rates that generated the kind of profits these financial titans demanded. War, on the other hand, was the ultimate profit machine. Governments at war would borrow any amount of money at any interest rate to avoid defeat. They would mortgage their entire futures, pledge the labor of unborn generations, sign away their national sovereignty, anything to keep the bullets flying and the armies marching. And the beautiful part, from a banker's perspective, was that it didn't matter who won. Winners and losers both had to pay back their debts with interest. The only guarantee was profit. So they began to orchestrate the conditions that would make war inevitable. It wasn't a conspiracy in the sense of men meeting in shadowy rooms to plan the details. It was something far more sophisticated, the systematic creation of financial pressures and incentives that would push European leaders toward conflict. They manipulated currency exchanges to create economic tensions between nations. They provided selective credit to arms manufacturers while starving other industries of capital. They used their control of financial media to spread fears about economic competition and national decline. The assassination in Sarajevo was real enough, but it was merely the spark that ignited a powder keg these financiers had been carefully packing for years. When Austria-Hungary needed money to mobilize against Serbia, the bankers were there with open checkbooks. When Russia needed credit to defend its Slavic ally, the loans were approved. When Germany required financing for its invasion of Belgium, the gold flowed freely. Every escalation, every mobilization, every declaration of war required money that these nations didn't have, and the international banking network was ready to provide it all, at a price. Within months of the war's beginning, the profits were staggering. JP Morgan alone arranged over $3 billion in loans to the Allied powers, equivalent to hundreds of billions in today's money. The Rothschild banks coordinated financing for multiple governments simultaneously, playing all sides and ensuring that regardless of the war's outcome, their investments would be repaid. German banks, many of them connected through intricate partnerships with their supposed enemies in London and New York, financed the Kaiser's war machine with equal enthusiasm. But the genius of their system went deeper than just lending money. These banking houses also controlled much of the industrial capacity needed to wage modern war. Steel companies, chemical manufacturers, shipyards, munitions factories, all of them were either directly owned by or heavily financed by the same financial networks that were lending money to governments. They created a perfect circle. Governments borrowed money to buy weapons from companies the bankers controlled, using money the bankers had created out of thin air to fight wars that generated the demand for more weapons and more loans. The human cost was irrelevant to this calculation. Millions of young men died not for their countries, not for noble causes, not for democracy or freedom, or any of the other slogans their governments fed them. They died to generate profits for financiers who had never seen a battlefield, never heard a shell explode, never watched their friends bleed out in the mud of no man's land. Every death, every maimed soldier, every destroyed city represented a line item in a ledger that showed steadily increasing returns on investment. And here's the most chilling part: it worked exactly as planned. By the time the armistice was signed in 1918, the international banking system had not just survived the war, it had consolidated power in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1914. Governments that had been sovereign nations before the war were now debt slaves to financial institutions. The gold standard that had limited the bankers' ability to create money out of nothing was shattered. Central banks gained unprecedented power over national economies, and the stage was set for an even more profitable conflict just 2 decades later. The story I'm telling you isn't speculation or conspiracy theory. It's documented history, hidden in plain sight in financial records, government archives, and the private correspondence of the men who orchestrated it. The evidence is overwhelming once you know where to look. And the pattern they established in 1914 has been repeated in every major conflict since. The fingerprints of financial manipulation are everywhere once you start looking. Take the Panic of 1907, just 7 years before the war began. This wasn't a random economic. It was a carefully orchestrated crisis designed to demonstrate to the American government it needed that they desper central bank. JP Morgan himself played the role of savior, swooping in to rescue failing banks and restore confidence. But the real purpose was to create the Federal Reserve System in 1913, giving private bankers unprecedented control over America's money supply just in time for the European war that was already being planned. The timing wasn't coincidental. By 1913, the same financial networks that controlled European banking had secured their grip on American finance. The Federal Reserve Act was passed during Christmas week when most congressmen had gone home, railroaded through by politicians who either didn't understand what they were signing or had been bought off by banking interests. Senator Nelson Aldrich, the bill's primary sponsor, had deep ties to the Rockefeller banking empire. His daughter would later marry John D. Rockefeller Jr. This wasn't legislation. It was a family business transaction disguised as government policy. With the Federal Reserve in place, American bankers could now create unlimited amounts of money to lend to European governments. The gold standard still technically existed, but it had been effectively neutered. Banks could issue currency backed by government bonds instead of gold reserves. This meant they could literally create money out of thin air, lend it at interest, and collect real wealth in return. It was the ultimate alchemy, turning paper into power, debt into dominion. The web of connections between these banking houses reveals the true scope of their coordination. Max Warburg sat on the board of the German Reichsbank, while his brother Paul Warburg helped establish the Federal Reserve. The Rothschild banks in London and Paris maintained constant communication despite their countries being at war. Through neutral Swiss banks and American intermediaries, money flowed freely across battle lines. Enemy governments were funding each other's destruction through the same financial institutions, and those institutions were collecting interest from both sides. But the bankers needed more than just the ability to create money. They needed governments desperate enough to borrow it at any cost. This required a war that would be more expensive, far, and destructive than anything Europe had ever experienced. The traditional model of warfare, armies meeting on battlefields for a few decisive engagements, wouldn't generate enough debt to satisfy their appetite for profit. They needed industrial warfare, a grinding war of attrition that would consume men and materials at an unprecedented rate. The technology existed to make this possible. Machine guns could slaughter thousands in minutes. Artillery could level entire cities. Poison gas could clear trenches that conventional weapons couldn't touch. Submarines could sink merchant vessels loaded with supplies. Aircraft could bomb civilian populations. But these technologies were expensive, and they required constant resupply of ammunition, fuel, and replacement equipment. Perfect for bankers who profited from every shell fired, every gallon of fuel burned, every rifle manufactured. They also needed to ensure the war wouldn't end too quickly through negotiation or decisive victory. Multiple peace initiatives emerged during the conflict, including proposals from the Pope, neutral governments, and even some of the warring nations themselves. But each time, financing was mysteriously available to continue fighting while funding for peace negotiations dried up. Governments that might have been willing to negotiate found themselves locked into loan agreements that required them to continue borrowing and fighting until their war aims were achieved. The influenza pandemic of 1918 provides another telling example of how these financial networks operated. As millions died from disease, pharmaceutical companies controlled by the same banking interests that were financing the war made fortunes selling medications and treatments. They had no incentive to end either the pandemic or the war quickly, because both were generating massive profits. The human suffering was simply the cost of doing business. Meanwhile, the propaganda machines that convinced ordinary people to support the war were also funded by banking interests. Newspapers, which depended on advertising revenue from companies controlled by the financial elite, churned out stories about German atrocities, heroic allies, and the noble cause of democracy. Movie theaters showed films depicting the enemy as subhuman monsters. Schools taught children to buy war bonds and support the troops. Every institution of civil society was mobilized to maintain popular support for a war that was systematically destroying European civilization for financial gain. The scale of the deception was breathtaking. Soldiers were told they were fighting for their countries while their governments had already mortgaged those countries to foreign bankers. Citizens were urged to make sacrifices for the war effort while the profits flowed to the same international financiers who had created the crisis in the first place. Families grieved their dead sons while the men responsible counted their blood money in marble palaces far from the front lines. By 1917, the financial pressures had become so intense that several governments were on the verge of collapse. The Russian Revolution wasn't just a political uprising, it was a debt crisis that destroyed the Tsarist regime when it could no longer service its massive war loans. The German government was printing money so rapidly that inflation was already beginning to destroy the currency. France and Britain were completely dependent on American loans to continue fighting. The war had become a financial house of cards, held together only by the bankers' willingness to keep extending credit. But this precarious situation was exactly what the financiers wanted. Desperate governments would agree to any terms, sign any treaty, surrender any sovereignty to keep the money flowing. The peace negotiations at Versailles weren't really about ending the war. They were about restructuring European debt in a way that would guarantee decades of future payments to the banking houses that had financed the carnage. The reparations imposed on Germany weren't designed to punish the losers or compensate the winners. They were designed to create a permanent debt structure that would require Germany to borrow money from international banks to pay other countries, who would then deposit that money back into the same banking system. It was a perpetual motion machine of debt that ensured the financiers would collect interest forever, regardless of Germany's ability to actually pay. And when the inevitable collapse came in the 1930s, when the debt pyramid finally toppled and the global economy crashed, the same banking networks were ready with the solution. Another war, even bigger than the last. The pattern was set and more profitable. The system was proven, and the profits were too enormous to abandon. This wasn't just ancient history. This was the blueprint for how modern warfare would be financed, how nations would be controlled through debt, and how a small group of financial elites would accumulate power that dwarfed the authority of any government. The techniques perfected between 1914 and 1918 are still being used today, just with different technologies and more sophisticated methods. So there it is. The real story of World War I isn't about nationalism or imperialism or the clash of ideologies. It's about bankers who turned human suffering into the most profitable business model in history. They created the template for modern warfare: endless debt, industrial slaughter, and financial control that survives long after the last shot is fired. The men who orchestrated this carnage walked away richer than kings while millions rotted in unmarked graves. They consolidated power that no emperor had ever dreamed of wielding, and they established a system that has been replicated in every major conflict since. From the trenches of Verdun to the financial battlefields of today, the pattern remains the same. Create the crisis, finance both sides, collect the interest, and walk away when the smoke clears. The next time you hear about rising tensions between nations, economic sanctions, or military build-ups, ask yourself who benefits from the chaos. Follow the money. See who's extending the credit and collecting the interest. Because the bankers who secretly started World War I didn't disappear in 1918. They just got better at hiding their fingerprints. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't recognize the pattern, it will crush you all the same. If this opened your eyes to something you'd never seen before, hit subscribe. The truth is always hidden in plain sight, and I'll show you where to look.